We are talking about Lacan's lecture on March 17th, 1954. Okay, again, these are very, very difficult pages because Lacan also seems to be rambling a little bit and jumping from one topic to the next. And it's hard to see like the thread that is connecting these different items. So let me try to explain the main arguments that he's making there. First, let's read this that is here in the PowerPoint. Full speech, says Lacan, is speech which aims at, which forms the truth such as it becomes established in the recognition of one person by another. Full speech is speech which performs. One of the subjects finds himself afterwards other than he was before. That is why this dimension cannot be evaded in the analytic experience. So what is he talking about? What are these words? So we have this contrast between full speech and empty speech in French, and I apologize if someone speaks French here, but it's something like parole pleine and parole vide. Right? So this means like full word or empty word. Yes, literally. What is empty speech? Think about a client, a patient who is speaking at length, but the words function more as a screen than as a revelation. For example, he's talking about an argument with his brother, and we can see that this episode that he's relating to us is creating anxiety in him. And when this person is talking about this conflict in the analytic session, he falls back to some cliche, like saying, oh, you know how it always is with brothers. Or maybe they justify their behavior in a defensive way, or they stay on the level of giving us a lot of factual details of what happened. Basically, they are talking from ego to ego, from the ego of the patient to the ego of the analyst. Nothing's happening in terms of analysis. You can also think about these patients that start chit-chatting and asking you about things in your life, or maybe updating us about trivial facts about their week. We feel that they're just trying to fill the hour, right? Like they want the analytic hour to finish. And their actual desire remains untouched. So this would be empty speech, parole vide. Then we have full speech, parole pleine, and this is speech in which the subject is involved in what is said and is transformed by the act of saying it. These are very oversimplistic examples, right? But let us think, like, imagine that the patient is talking about this fight against his brother, and then he realizes that the specific swear word, like the curse that he used against his brother, is actually the same phrase that his grandfather used against him when he was a child. So he's making a connection with something in his personal and libidinal history. And for sure, if this happens in session, a therapist, even if it's not a psychoanalyst, right, a revelation like this shows up. And we pay attention to this. So full speech is addressed to another, to an analyst who receives this full speech and recognizes it. It is not like there was a previous truth, a previous fact that had to be uncovered. Actually, this is the performative aspect Lacan is emphasizing. Performative is a word that comes from philosophy of language. There was an extremely good, famous English philosopher called John Austin, who wrote this great book. It's an incredible book called How to Do Things with Words. And what John Austin says in this theory of performative language is that we have this common sense opinion that language is used to transmit information. So I have something in my mind. I know that something happened yesterday, for example, at school with my kid, and I want to tell my wife this information. So communication, the function of communication is to make this information travel from my mind to her mind. So it's a pre-existing fact, and we're just communicating, meaning sharing information. Some statement about the world that has some truth value that can be true or false is transmitted to the other person. This is the common sense function of language. And John Austin in this book, How to Do Things with Words, says this is completely wrong. We use language primarily to do things. We swear, like in this example, right? We curse, we promise, we declare the session open, or we declare love, or we threaten. We also inform, but this is just one more possibility among other ones. We confess something, we promise. We use language primarily to act in the world. So this is the performative dimension. This is the idea that we use language to act in the world. We make things with words. Lacan is taking this idea that when there is full speech, it is performative. It is something is created. When you, for example, are making this connection between the swear word you used against your brother and something that your grandfather used to say, a new truth is created there in that speech act. And because this is performed in this way, because there is a symbolic act being performed there, then the subject, Lacan says, comes out other than he was before. There is a shift, there is a transformation when you make this connection. Full speech is like the moment something true about one's history or one's desire gets articulated, gets expressed in language. I don't know why the translators prefer to keep this word in French, communiquer, but basically empty speech has to do with what is communicated. For example, an agreement, a factual agreement about a situation. But full speech is more related to this plane of recognition between subjects. So what you are saying is also received by the other person, received by the analyst, and this provokes a transformation. Psychoanalysis takes aim at full speech, and full speech is performative. You can see that if we think about the three registers of Lacan, the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, full speech is related to the symbolic register. Something's happening on the symbolic level. Let me read you this. This is also taken literally from Lacan's text. The first of the contradictions to appear is the remarkable fact that the analytic method, if it aims at attaining full speech, starts off on a path leading in the diametrically opposed direction, insofar as it instructs the subject to delineate a speech as devoid as possible of any assumption of responsibility, and that it even frees him from any expectation of authenticity. It calls him to say everything that comes to his head. So, what do we say to our patients if we're doing psychoanalysis? We say, free associate. This is the first rule of psychoanalysis. Tell me everything that comes to your mind. If you're talking about something that happened at school, or with your friends, you can give me factual, you can update me on your week, but please keep this attitude of being open to whatever association comes to your mind. Don't try to direct your thoughts in one specific direction, right? Do not exclude anything that shows up in your association, even if you think, oh, this is irrelevant, or is stupid, or is shameful, or my analyst will not be interested in this. You need not to censor yourself, to not organize your speech coherently, and not to worry about truthfulness. So this is the irony, this is the paradox. Lacan is saying that in order for the patient to be able to speak the truth, he needs to forget about the truth. In order to be authentic, he needs to forget about authenticity. Why? Because if we start controlling our authenticity, or how truthful this is, we will censor ourselves. We will not free associate. And actually, we will fall back to empty speech. So to achieve full speech, we need to obey this first rule of psychoanalysis, free association. Lacan also says this in this lecture in a strange way. He says that we push the patient below the level of recognition. Recognition here means this symbolic recognition between subjects. Right? I bump into my neighbor in the street and we recognize each other. We exchange greetings, we ask about our families. So I am addressing my neighbor with respect, yes? Or if we are in our job and our boss is asking us questions, we address each other with full responsibility. We are accountable for the things we say. Lacan says, in free association, we do the opposite. Do not be accountable. Say whatever. Do not be politically correct. I don't mind if you are talking about some perversion or some racist ideas that you have. We suspend judgment about everything. We allow free association to reign. And this is the best path to actually achieve full speech. So in free association, we go below the level of recognition, below the level of mutual respect. We take everything that comes up, we take it into account. Fragments of memories, incoherent dreams, slips of tongue, repetitions, associations. It's like the words become almost like objects that we take into consideration to operate, to connect the dots, right? To look for this pattern in the free association. So this is why Lacan also says this in a very enigmatic way in this class. He says that this lower level, this level below recognition, concerns the third party. He says the object. So what he's saying here is that the speech of free association treats discourse as an object, as a material to be observed. The patient can speak without being a responsible I, and speech becomes like detached from the ego intentions, from like the way we try to self-present in a nice way to others. Okay, so analysis aims at full speech, that is speech in which the subject recognizes himself in what he says, assumes responsibility for his desire, and speaks authentically in relation to another person, to the person of the analyst. But the method to get there begins in the opposite direction. Free association asks the patient to suspend exactly those ordinary conditions of responsible discourse. There is a lot of controversy here, and I will not go deeper in this controversy, but you will see in this lecture, he spends a lot of paragraphs, a lot of pages talking about other psychoanalysts and other theories that were like predominant at his time. Mainly, we were talking about Anna Freud and the Anna Freudians in previous sessions. And they are more akin to the idea that the analyst possesses some kind of superior knowledge about life and about desire, and that the patient is ignorant about what's happening to himself or herself. And the cure, the psychoanalytic cure, moves forward by a kind of explanation and education from the therapist to the client. We suggest, this is also similar to the idea of hypnosis, right? Or imagine like an interpretation where the therapist is just explaining to the patient, oh, you have this symptom because you are repressing your oral sexuality. Or this symptom has this meaning that you're in love, secretly in love with your father, but this is not acceptable for your ego, or that your father traumatized you in some way, or that you are identifying with Uncle George. This kind of indoctrination, Lacan says, makes no sense. The patient already comes to session like with a system of beliefs, of narratives. And the idea of psychoanalysis is not to indoctrinate the patient, to replace the ideas and prejudices that he comes with some other ideas or some other beliefs that will in the end be some other set of neurotic illusions. This is actually dangerous for Lacan because then there is some kind of domination of the patient, of indoctrination of the patient, to make the patient, the analysand, in Lacan's terms, adopt the analyst theory to convince him. And Lacan calls this, in these pages, an intellectualist position. So Lacan says it is not on this plane of agreeing about the object that we can make progress. We can make progress on the symbolic level, on this symbolic exchange that is produced by free association, transference, and the symbolic exchange between the analyst and the analysand. This is where the analytic efficacy resides. The analytic efficacy comes from free association, symbolic exchange, and this has to happen in the context of transference. What is transference? Simplest way of explaining this is a kind of passionate love between the therapist and the patient, the analyst and the analysand. This has to do a lot with what we've been working before, narcissism, narcissist libido, and this is both something that can become very dangerous for the analytic process, but it's also the only opportunity for the analytic process to move forward. It's both at the same time. It's a danger and an opportunity, this transference lab. So we will talk a little bit more about this. In its essence, the efficacious transference which we are considering is quite simply the speech act. Each time a man speaks to another in an authentic and full manner, there is, in the true sense, transference, symbolic transference. Something takes place which changes the nature of the two beings present. So it's performative, it's on the symbolic plane, it's a symbolic exchange, and because of this symbolic act, something changes. For example, when I realized I used the same curse word that my grandfather was using against me, something changes. So we are prioritizing the symbolic register, but we were saying transference is not only symbolic. You remember also the people who were here a few sessions ago, we were giving this example of someone who is free associating in session, and we can feel that this patient is brave, is able to free associate, is getting closer to some kind of traumatic scene. Something important is about to be revealed in session. Something will happen. And then the patient interrupts herself and says something like, of course, but you don't know. You don't want to know about this. Or I'm digressing too much. Or I will not say this because I think it's disgusting. Or maybe he tells us, but I think you need to stop the session already, right? It is late, I think. So in these cases, the patient is involving the therapist in order to stop full speech, to stop the free association. So transference here is playing for the resistance. Transference appears as an obstacle on the imaginary plane, right? When the patient is identifying with us and telling us, or projecting, right? And telling us, you're in a hurry to finish this session. It is, of course, it's the patient that doesn't want to go there, right? To talk about this difficult thing. So he's projecting and telling us that we are in a hurry to finish. And this is a projection. And this is happening on the imaginary plane. They are fantasizing, they're imagining that this is what we want. The transference that we encounter in analysis is not purely symbolic. There is also this imaginary plane that usually constitutes an obstacle. And this is what we find in classical psychoanalytic literature. Projections onto the analyst, when the patient takes us for their father or wife, rival at work, or brother, yes, or they think we are judging them, or that we idealize them, or that we are hostile against them. The main point here that Lacan is making is that transference doesn't belong just to one register. Transfer is not played out only in the imaginary or in the symbolic. Actually, it articulates the three registers. There is a real element, a symbolic element, and an imaginary element to transference. I will skip. There is a long controversy with James Strachey, that is a very important figure in the history of psychoanalysis. This is the person that translated Freud's complete works from German into English. He was first a patient of Freud for 2 years, I think, in Vienna, but then I think he moved to England, and then went back to England, and then he was in the International Psychoanalytic Society, and he has a very controversial also theory of transference that Lacan is talking about, but we will skip that. And let's focus on transference love. This is the passionate love that appears in the transferential relationship. The relationship between the analyst and the analysand. Lacan makes a distinction between two kinds of love. One is what can be conveyed by the Greek word eros, E-R-O-S, which is some kind of universal mystical force that binds humans together. Sometimes it's a romanticized version of love, right? It's a universal conception where we're all united by this universal force, and we are all part of the same society, and we love each other, we protect each other, and this is like the glue that keeps us together. And there is an important role for this conception of love, but Lacan is saying in terms of the clinical work, this is not the interesting thing. What's happening there in transference when a patient is in analysis has to be analyzed on the plane of the ego and the non-ego. So this means in the place of relationship between egos. Again, identification, idealization, rivalry, dependence, all the things that happen in not only in analysis, I would say in psychotherapy in general, right? No matter which school or which approach you're using in your personal practice, this will happen to you. The client that is fascinated with you, or the client who hates you, or who always thinks you are missing the point or not understanding them, or the one that you buy a sweater and next week the client comes exactly with the same sweater. This happens a lot. Identification, rivalry, dependence, fascination, all these aspects belong to narcissism, to the imaginary organization of the ego. So it is important, right? If we are an analyst, if a patient falls in love with us, we need to understand that it's not because of our qualities. This is not a transparent encounter between subjects. This has to be understood in terms of narcissism and what Lacan called the mirror relations, right? Like the analyst becomes the ideal image in which the subject wants to see himself or herself. The analyst is like a figure that is completing the subject. The subject is lacking something, is suffering because of something, feels incomplete, and then finds completion in the figure of the analyst. The analyst becomes like a guarantee for the patient's being. So this is not like this kind of cosmological love, not a principle underlying social life. It's not an authentic encounter between two people. This is a kind of destabilizing love. Lacan actually says, this was enigmatic for me when I read it. He says this is a sort of psychological catastrophe. So again, you see how this has the two aspects at the same time. This falling in love of the patient with the analyst. Sometimes it can also appear again as profound hatred also. It's not a harmonious union. It's disruptive because it affects the ego and it affects narcissism. You become, but this happens also if you fall in love with someone, right? That you start idealizing the other person, you become a little bit dependent, your ego becomes dependent on the other person, your self-consistence becomes fragile. The analytic situation tends to produce these conditions. Again, if a patient becomes, like if a patient falls in love with me, it's not because I'm smart or I'm empathetic or my face, my hair. It's because the situation is asymmetric. There is an asymmetry in the very structure of the session. There is the analysand and the analyst. There is someone who speaks and someone who listens. There's no reciprocity there. The patient is receiving the undivided attention of the analyst. And they only talk about what has to do with the analysand. They are opening up and disclosing their psychological intimacy, but not the analyst. So all the attention, as if he were a child. This only happens to you when you're a child and when you're a patient. To have an adult that's giving you their undivided attention, at least for some time. So there is a structural link between the analytic relation and this kind of transference love. And this has to be understood in terms of the subject lack, her desire, her narcissistic identifications, and the demand for recognition. Yes, because we also have, for example, patients who every time they do something that they imagine, that is what we wanted from them, they come very proud to session to show us their progress. Looking for what? For this recognition. This has to do a lot with Freud's text on narcissism that we were discussing last Saturday. You may remember that Freud says that there is a primary narcissism, the narcissism of babies, the child that for the first time is unifying his body image, unifying his instincts, his drive, consolidating a united identity. Lacan says, he refers to Freud, that he says, yes, the baby is autoerotic from the moment of his birth or her birth, in the sense that there is an enjoyment of the body, of the parts of the body from the beginning, the oral, the different zones that can be touched and in contact with other people. Like there's an enjoyment, a pleasure in the body from the beginning. But narcissism requires an additional unification act. Lacan will relate this to his own theorization of the mirror stage, the moment between 6 months and 18 months that the child is looking at herself or himself in the mirror and saying, that is me. Yeah. Maybe they don't say it, but they smile, they move a hand, they contemplate their own unified figure. This is the origin of narcissism, this new psychological act. And what Freud is saying is the libido, the sexual energy that we used to relate to objects like the baby wants mommy, the baby wants mommy's breast, or when we fall in love. I'm in love with this person. That's my love object. But he's saying this has a prehistory in narcissism. The moment that libido, sexual energy, is actually attached to the ego itself. And only from this original primary narcissism, we can go out into the world and relate to objects that start to become interesting or attractive for us, right? So both Lacan and Freud focus on this glorious feeling of I exist, I am one. But this first narcissism, this primary narcissism, Freud was telling us, needs to be abandoned because of reality. Reality teaches us that loved objects, unfortunately, are not part of us. We cannot control everything. So sometimes mommy will be there, sometimes she will be gone. And if I want the breast, I need to call her. So we go from narcissism, from love of one's ego libido, to object relations, object libido. But what happens with this initial idealized ego? What Freud was saying, this is what we were discussing last week, is that we go from loving one's perfect ego to accepting that we are not perfect. And in that way, we overcome primary narcissism. But this love of perfection is displaced to an ideal. Now the child starts admiring people. He or she has he or her own idols, heroes. Mom, dad, maybe a superhero on TV. And he's forming an idealized model of perfection in his own psyche. And this Freud calls this the ego ideal, which is a way of saying the libido, the narcissistic libido, doesn't just disappear. It's displaced from the ego to the ego ideal. We can, of course, also invest objects. We will love other people. We can love our job. We can love our pets, even material objects. But Freud says sometimes we love someone not actually with object libido, but with narcissistic libido. In other terms, we love someone for narcissistic reasons. For example, we love our boyfriend or our girlfriend because we imagine that they are like the best complement. They complete us, right? What we are lacking, we are receiving this from this other person. So they give us a sense of narcissistic completion, of wholeness. Or we, just because they are ours, right? This is my boyfriend, my girlfriend. So they are so intelligent, so beautiful, they make us closer to our ego ideal. Or maybe we find a person that is all the time telling us how wonderful we are. And we keep them for that reason, because they are the best mirror in the world, like in Snow White, right? The perfect mirror that's telling the queen how wonderful she is for narcissistic reasons. You can say that the queen loves the mirror because the mirror is all the time telling her that she's the most beautiful woman in the whole kingdom, until the day she says, actually, you are second because we have Snow White also in the list, she's first. And then she wants to break the mirror, of course. This was kind of a long detour. My purpose was to understand one of Lacan's complicated sentences when he says that transference love, the love that happens in the therapeutic relationship, means that the loved object is confounded with the subject's ego ideal. The patient loves the analyst, but also mixes it up, confounds the analyst with his or her own ego ideal. So I love you becomes something like, through you, I love an idealized image of myself. So this is the mirror structure of imaginary love. The other becomes a mirror, an ideal image and a narcissistic support, rather than a separate subject. And I think this kind of paradox is very interesting, right? That narcissistic love seems oriented toward the other, but actually is organized around the subject's own narcissistic economy. So this is from Lacan in the PowerPoint. In the narcissistic character of the relationship of imaginary love, the loved object is confounded by means of one whole facet of its qualities, of its attributes, and also of its impact on the psychic economy with the subject's ego ideal. So this is the point, that the object is confounded with the subject's ego ideal. There is also, we'll try not to go too deep into that, but there is this whole controversy also with Carl Jung. Freud wants to keep the libido separated from other drives or instincts, like hunger or everything that has to do with self-preservation. But Jung goes in a different direction, right? He has what is called a monistic position, which means that there is just one type of psychic energy. So libido encompasses everything, comprises everything. It's some kind of universal force, some kind of energy. In the same way as we were talking about this universal love, Lacan says that Jung is proposing a general psychic interest that simply comes and goes, colors the situations, then fades out. What is lost in Carl Jung is this distinction between sexual energy and non-sexual energy. And both Freud and Lacan will say that if libido just means vital energy in general, then the concept is not useful anymore. It dissolves in some kind of vague general biological force. Lacan says in this lecture that libido has nothing to do with instinctual registers other than the sexual. So this is against Jung. Libido has nothing to do with those other aspects of our psychological life that are separate from the sexual. If you conflate libido and ego drives, then libido stops being a useful psychoanalytic concept. Libido has to do with sexuality, but also, Lacan will propose, we will come to that, with culture, with the symbolic world, not only with functions of self-preservation. All this, in a way, comes together in the discussion of psychosis that we were touching upon a little bit in previous sessions, especially when we were talking about Freud's case of the Wolfman and his concept of foreclosure, Verwerfung, which is actually a concept in Lacan. Freud uses the word, but Lacan makes it into a technical concept. So let's talk about psychosis. They're thinking especially about paranoia, also to some extent about schizophrenia. Jung thinks that what happens in psychosis is that the libido comes back to the ego. And this is some kind of energetic balance. But again, remember that in Jung, libido has lost this specificity of being a sexual energy. So it's just some general interest into the world. You withdraw from the world, and this mental energy becomes introverted. And Lacan says that Jung's explanation lacks discriminating power because it's mixing up these two things. He writes in German in that part, he says, Jung's conception is ohne Unterscheidung, right? Which means like without distinction. What happens if you have a psychotic patient? Let me start with the example I was giving you last session of one of my clients that I was telling you when he started, I didn't notice anything strange. And then a couple of months, he starts telling me that he's working on a formula to create energy about, like, rather than using oil or things like that, he can create energy with a specific mix with salt and mud and some other elements. I think there's something strange here, right? And then he says that his formula is very successful, that he can now have found a new kind of energy source that will solve the world's energy problems. And then he starts telling me, but the problem is that the Russians are spying on me because they want to steal the formula from me. And also the oil companies are putting cameras and microphones in my apartment because they don't want me to produce this formula because it will mean that oil companies go bankrupt. So, okay, clearly we are in, the client has become very delusional. And of course, I start thinking about a paranoid psychosis. First of all, we have this distorted perception of reality. His body image starts changing. For example, he starts talking about special sensors that are growing in his finger. And then with these sensors, he can detect whether the transformation was right, whether he's perceiving whether an object has energy or not. The theoretical problem, this is the hard part. The theoretical problem is this. Is Jung right? Because here we see that libido is not affecting only his sexuality. It's affecting his whole perception of reality, his relation to other people. He becomes like a very lonely. He doesn't want to talk to anybody because he's suspicious that anybody can be a hidden agent that wants to steal the formula from him. If libido is only sexual, how can a theory of libido account for this? For like this whole breakdown of the subject, like the disturbances in all the relations between this subject and his reality. So this pushes the theory of libido much farther. In psychosis, the very structuring of the ego, the body and the reality, everything is affected. Libido can no longer be conceived in a way as a localized sexual energy. It doesn't have to do only with sexual pleasure. Schizophrenia swamps the foundation with form. The disturbance affects the entire structuring form through which reality is organized. The whole organization of reality is in crisis, and his own identity and his own body image. And we can connect this with the cases we were discussing. Melanie Klein's Dick case, Lefort's case of the wolf child. These were cases in which also the world was falling apart, and the social bond with other people, like the affective relationships with other people, were also not able to, he was not able to maintain, neither of them, nor Robert, the wolf child, nor Dick, were able to maintain like these stable relationships with other people. So we have to accept, even though we are not following Jung in his monistic approach, we maintain the division between libido and self-preservation drives. We need to accept that Jung has a point, that libido participates in the very constitution of the subject's world, that libido is tied to how we structure our symbolic world, all our fantasies, our imaginary structuring of the world. Sexuality cannot be separated from language, from identification, from the ego. Desire organizes the whole subject's relation to reality itself. What schizophrenia is revealing is that, or psychosis in general is revealing, is that sexuality affects the entire subjective economy. Different ways in which neurotics and psychotics distort reality. There is reality distortion in both of them, but it's different. There is no this suspension of reality, this cancellation of reality that you see in psychosis. In neurotic, reality is still there, but it's mediated through the neurotic fantasies to deal with traumatic aspects of life, the neurotics. Our relation with reality is distorted in the sense that it is mediated by fantasy. We imagine things, we project, we idealize, we compete against. But while we're doing this, we're still invested in the objects. The libido is still attaching to these objects, the loved objects. And this is essential for psychoanalysis to work.